food that's on our table.
With today's industrialized method of food production, is what we eat really safe? How are genetically modified organisms in factory farms affecting our food?
Genetically modified organisms, GMOs, pose unparalleled threats. Nothing like them has ever existed in the entire course of life on this planet.
The campaign of ignorance that is currently being waged by the FDA is so insidious that the FDA actively opposes the honest labeling of genetically modified foods.
Every single independent study conducted on the impact of genetically modified food shows that it damages organs, it causes infertility, it causes immune system failure, it causes holes in the GI tract, it causes multiple organ system failure when it's eaten. It causes a variety of changes, some of which we can't even guess at, as new proteins are coded for by the altered DNA that we've never seen before. We are playing with genetic fire.
Genetic engineering is a process where scientists take genes from one species and force it into the DNA of other species. Even though there's been very little study on the health dangers, there's been sufficient evidence of harm to cause the American Academy of Environmental Medicine to say all doctors should prescribe non-GMO diets to everyone. They say that the animal feeding studies link GMOs to reproductive problems, immune system problems, accelerated aging, organ damage, gastrointestinal distress, dysfunctional regulation of cholesterol and insulin, to name a few.
These genetic systems, just in the last 5 years, have been shown of all higher plants and animals are far, far more complex than ever was believed. And so it turns out that in the splicing process, that mutations occur and can cause immune system problems. And this has been the biggest problem and has been shown a number of times.
An immune response is a reaction to something that's foreign that the body doesn't recognize and tries to push out. By definition, genetically modified foods have something foreign. When genetically modified soybeans were fed to rodents, we've seen changes in the testicles changing from pink to blue, changes in the sperm cells, changes in the uterus and ovaries, in the DNA functioning of the embryo offspring. We've seen smaller babies, a death rate that's 5 times that compared to controls. Sterile babies, even babies with hair growing in their mouths. And this has been done by government scientists as well as independent scientists who are at the top of their field.
American people are beginning to become more aware and wake up to the fact that their government has been corrupted by corporations and the food that they're feeding themselves has possibly serious human health risks.
The 1992 policy of the FDA claims that the agency is not aware of any information showing that GMOs are significantly different. And on the basis of that sentence, they said no testing was necessary, no labeling was necessary, and companies like Monsanto, that makes most of the genetically modified food products, they can determine if their genetically modified foods are safe. The most common reason why they genetically engineer crops is so that they don't die when sprayed with herbicide.
No genetically modified crop can grow unless it's attached to some kind of a pesticide. Those pesticides, more and more, are in these plants. They may have killed the weeds, they may have killed the insects, but the product is still on the plants, and if it's washed off, then it's in the water, it gets into the lakes, it gets into the oceans, it's everywhere. And it's toxic, it causes cancer, it also causes endocrine disruption. That's a technical term for change of hormones. They don't even want to label that this is genetically modified. The milk is genetically modified, or the crop is genetically modified. They say, if we label that, we won't be able to sell it because people won't buy it. Of course, people won't buy it because people don't want it.
The reason why we have 170 million acres of genetically engineered corn and soybeans and cotton and canola oil and sugar beets in the United States is because it doesn't have to be labeled. In the European Union, where labeling is required, There's almost no genetically engineered food on store shelves, in restaurants. There's almost none of it planted.
Today, more than 50 countries around the world allow labeling of genetically engineered foods.
The FDA came out with its infamous policy stating that genetically engineered foods are substantially equivalent to non-genetically engineered foods. The person in charge of labeling policy at that time was Michael Taylor, who had previously worked as an attorney and lobbyist for Monsanto. After Taylor left the FDA in the early 90s, he went back to Monsanto and then came back to the FDA.
The FDA has argued at Codex meetings that the average consumer is too ignorant to recognize the difference between a GMO-labeled food and a non-GMO labeled food, and they'd make the wrong choice. And that's their stated reason for opposing GMO labeling.
The UN Food Safety Standards Setting Organization that's jointly run by the World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization, that's called Codex Alimentarius. There was an 8-year process where all the countries in the world came together and talked about whether there should be safety assessments for genetically engineered crops, genetically engineered animals, and genetically engineered microorganisms. We went to all these meetings over 8 years. There's now global agreement that there should be required safety testing for these crops before they come on the market. And you know what? The U.S. does not require that.
It's the FDA and the USDA who helped lead the charge for these new food safety bills. There's nothing in those bills to protect you. It's there to protect the genetic engineering industry. And unfortunately, if we don't stop this, you won't see organic farmers. The laws in the bills currently are so strict, so arbitrary, that if you are a small organic farmer, you can't meet their requirements for safety. As a result, you'll go out of business.
As the chemical seed package has spread, and now with genetically engineered seed that originally was free in India because it belonged to the farmers, or was low cost because it was released from the public sector universities that did seed breeding. In the genetic engineering revolution, these seeds are now patented property of one corporation called Monsanto. Cotton seed used to cost 5 rupees, 7 rupees a kilogram. When Monsanto entered with its BT cotton, it shot the price up to 3,600 rupees a kilogram for seed.
The U.S. government was forced to spend $3 to $5 billion per year to prop up the prices of the GM crops that no one else wanted. The White House decided to fast-track biotechnology because they thought it would increase U.S. exports and U.S. domination of the food supply. But the opposite happened. And so the U.S. government was forced to spend $3 to $5 billion per year to prop up the prices of the GM crops that no one else wanted. So instead of admitting that they were a failure and withdrawing them, they've been trying to push open the markets, bullying other countries. George Bush filed a lawsuit essentially with the World Trade Organization against Europe, saying that their rejection of genetically modified foods was an illegal trade barrier. We know from WikiLeaks that the entire State Department apparatus has been used to try and push GMOs into other countries. In fact, the U.S. ambassador to France suggested that the United States create a hit list to retaliate against those players in Europe that were rejecting GMOs. Over and over again, the U.S. government has proved that their agenda is to promote biotechnology at any cost.
The GMO standards are being passed at the Codex level because, frankly, through lies. They're telling them that they're safe crops, that they're safe food products. They don't need to be labeled. We've been fighting for years to get mandatory labeling of GMO foods. We almost succeeded. But what happened is, at the last Codex meeting in Geneva, is that the U.S. tried to force this issue and actually called for a vote of this issue, and they lost. They actually lost because they wanted to use it as a bargaining chip for WTO, World Trade Organization, trade dispute to ram GMO foods down the mouths of the European Union, China, and Russia, and they lost.
NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, it basically forced corn that was largely genetically engineered into Mexico and took a couple of million farmers off the land because they couldn't compete with U.S. subsidized corn. And so the amount of millions of metric tons that was pushed into Mexico, some of it was planted, and it's genetically engineered, and it has cross-pollinated with the indigenous corn varieties in Mexico, which are the source of the genetic diversity of corn in the world. So it's a treasure that has been polluted.
In India, 250,000 farmers have committed suicide because they cannot sustain input costs.
The majority of farm suicides in India are in the cotton belt. 84%, according to our study done in Vidarbha, are linked to purchase of BT cotton seeds. So we call these seeds of suicide. The poor people, the poor small peasant, was wiped out right in the beginning because they couldn't afford these chemicals.
Shamla's fields were once fertile, but now they bring her only sadness. Her husband Chandar owed over $5,000 in debts and was hoping for heavy rains this season. 3 days ago, she tells me, he hung himself here. Ironically, the rains came a day after he died.
The most comprehensive analysis of GMOs shows that they actually reduce yield. But sustainable technologies, they can increase yield by an average of 79%. GMOs are stealing the money away from these more appropriate technologies.
The ISTAD report proved that organic and sustainable agriculture had the same and higher yields than conventional, chemical-intensive, genetically engineered crops. These herbicides are actually having a major impact in killing the beneficial soil microorganisms in the soil. As a result of the loss of beneficial soil microorganisms, not only have the yields gone down, but there's been a dramatic increase in the rise of crop diseases, which are infecting corn and soybeans in the U.S.
For one example of many, in 2001, a small California biotech company called Epicite patented a gene, which causes both men and women who eat it, in the form of any product, to produce antibodies to sperm. If the men eat the Epicite gene, they produce antibodies to their own sperm, rendering them irreversibly sterile. If women eat the Epicite gene, when they have intercourse, their bodies produce antibodies to the sperm that has been deposited, and they become infertile through the destruction of the sperm. Now, DuPont and Monsanto formed a joint venture, purchased the Epicite firm, and, quote, commercialized the Epicite gene. Do you want to know if the food that you're eating contains the Epicite gene? Sure you do. How about the food that your children are eating, or your grandchildren? Sure you do. But the FDA, the Fraud and Death Administration, has made sure that under current laws, it is illegal for you to have that information.